A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, among other things, there is some research that shows that the numbers of young men in church has begun to grow larger than the number of young women. And there's often been this perception that women are more religious than men, but that may be changing. Stephen McAlpine is an award-winning Christian author, pastor and national consultant for churches and Christian schools. He's been grappling with and I think enjoying the concept that young men are increasing numbers in church. Stephen McAlpine, a special welcome back to 2020.
Great to be with you, Neil.
Stephen, what is it that's captured your imagination here about young men and some changes that are coming?
Well, probably a couple of things. At the moment, I'm doing a regional tour in Melbourne to men's conferences talking about what it means to be a man, which is interesting. But also Giles Coren, who's a well-known English writer. His father was a very famous English satirist and editor of the Punch magazine. Comes from a nominally Jewish family and is atheist. But last week he said he was giving up atheism for Lent, which is a great headline, but he meant he's decided to go to church. And the reason he's been going to church on a frequent basis is that his son, out of the blue, said, "Dad, I want to go to church." Now, it's not even that Giles is that young, but his son certainly is. And this change happened.
It's confronting for atheists, no doubt. If you're a father of a teenage son and your son says, "Dad, I want to go to church," that might be causing you to think about all sorts of ways that your son might not be interacting with the world in the way that you thought they might.
Well, you know what's really interesting about the article, and it was in the Times, and it's of London, so it caused enough of a stir because lots of people read it and lots of people had heard of Giles Coren, was that Giles himself said that he'd grown up having to go to an Anglican school, but it wasn't anything to him. But he suddenly realised when his son went to church, he thought, "I'll go and see what it's like." And he realised, actually, the faith I don't believe in or haven't believed in is the Christian faith. I wonder what it's about. And so he was exploring it from that way. But he said his son is full on into it in a way that he is kind of still observing it, but is saying that's drawing him in. And that's the thing I've seen is like a lot of younger people going, "I'm going full tilt into this." So even a church I know that I had recently pastored had a bunch of younger men coming cold, so to speak, and getting baptised in the last year or two. And that's raising some questions about what's going on wider in the culture, I think.
You know, we might be led to think, I wonder if this is just a phase, but the trend seems to be this way. Even the National Church Life Survey people have come up with men increasing in church and now outnumbering women. We might think it's just a phase, but I'm interested in some of the thoughts that you might have around, meaning and higher purpose in a life for a young man, because they might not be finding the sorts of things that they had been looking for in the wider world without God. Is there any connection here that you can draw?
Yeah, look, I saw those NCL, National Church Life Survey material as well, and then I saw it on the ABC reported, and I thought that's interesting. Younger men are more identifying as Christian, religious, but also not just kind of spiritual, but actually I want to go to church. I think that Christianity is the right framework. And I think one of the issues you've noticed over the last 20 years is that there's been a certain level of two things: redundancy about where young men are at, like, a young woman could do anything that a young man can do. And the first word you will find if you Google masculinity on Google is toxic, the first word. So you're getting men who are feeling redundant, and also they're worried about that the framework of what it means to be a man, the meaning and purpose question, is getting further away from them. And I think those things have added up. You see younger men are much more likely to do risky behaviour, much more mental health issues are huge, and their test results at universities and schools are lower than those of young women. And there's questions being asked. If the question that is asked around a woman recently has been, what is a woman? The male question is not what is a man, but what is a man for? I think there's meaning and purpose questions going on in our culture that young men are asking, and they're finding their way to church to ask those questions.
We used to talk about the feminisation of the church, and because it tended to be that women outnumbered men, there was a thought that there was a feminisation that was even a repulsion to some young men. Do you think that there is some sort of change that has happened? Is there something in the way we do church that might be attracting young men, or is this just something that young men at large are discovering that there's something not quite working for them and they are seeking out some answers in church?
Well, I wrote about this recently on my blog about what would it be like for a young man to think about coming to church. And one of the things was I think people will investigate online what church is well before they ever come. And what you're finding with many young men is that they're not looking for kind of church light, so to speak. They're looking for something that's a little bit crunchy, which is why you see a return to much more liturgical forms of Christianity. It's interesting even that Giles's son ends up at a very liturgical Anglican church. And I think there's something in that. There's something that's leaning into history about liturgical forms of worship. Now, that's not to say they're all good, and it's not to say that we all don't have our own liturgies. But they're not looking for something that looks the same as what they've already got in the world out there. They're looking for something a little different. And I think that's critical. And I think the other thing that's critical is that I think Jordan Peterson was a gateway to many young men asking about church, because I've met several young men who came to church and said, I started reading a book by this guy you might have heard of called Jordan Peterson. I thought maybe church has got something. Now, that's not saying Jordan Peterson's a Christian. It's just saying the same questions about order and meaning and purpose are being raised. And then I think they took a next step and said, what does the church say about that? Because church seems to be something that's talking about meaning and purpose.
I remember just a little while back, we were talking about some of the well-known public intellectuals, and Jordan Peterson was a name among the names we were talking about. And the fact that there was this movement of these intellectuals towards a spirituality, and I remember you were saying at the time that some of the more traditional models of church, like the Anglican Church or even the Catholic Church, may have held some level of draw because of the timelessness of those movements. Do you think that young men might actually be in the wake of what's been happening by way of public intellectuals like Jordan Peterson following on, and now we're seeing some benefit from that?
Well, what you get, I think, you get trickle-down economics when it comes to spirituality as well, right? So you get high-level intellectual frameworks, then you get popularizers like the Russell Brands, like even Wes Huff doing a famous, the apologist, doing a famous interview with Joe Rogan, and Wes Huff looks a bit muscly. He looks like he hits the gym. It doesn't look like he's wearing a suit. He's wearing a black T-shirt, and people are going, wow, that looks pretty robust. And he's got a lot to say, and he's quite intellectual. And it filters down, and then people read the popular books. And so I think once those ideas start to filter down through into society, young men can see it. Now, the flip side, of course, is that you can give them a sort of a Christianized bad version of masculinity as well if you're not careful. And I think we've got to be careful how we bring some young men into the mix on where we're going Christianly, because what it means to be a Christian man is going to drift apart from what it means to be a man who doesn't know Jesus. And I think that's going to be the discipleship issue in the next sort of 10 years.
You know, Jesus the tradesman, I can't help but thinking as you're talking about masculinity, that what are the biblical models here? And you had to be pretty much a strong and masculine man to have those roles as we see that have happened in biblical history. But Jesus the tradesman, who loves his mother and is about his father's business, driven by mission. Do you think there's something there that could captivate the heart of young men?
Look, I think one of the things that young men are realising is that the definition of a man, in one sense, or one of the things that personifies a man, is that he turns up. He turns up for the stuff that he should turn up for. So responsibility. And you look at Jesus and the tradie issue, that people went up to Jesus and called him rabbi, and he was, but he was a rabbi who had a craft, and so. The hands that got nailed to the cross had been hands that held nails, that held hammers, and he had done those sorts of things. And so I think there's something in the purpose of Jesus and the kind of just the draw card he has as a person that is intriguing young men. And as you read the New Testament, you don't get the idea of some sort of disembodied spiritual ideas from Jesus. You get a lot of meaning and purpose. You get a lot of take up your cross and follow me things. And I think the feminization aspect of people say that it was women that went to church, maybe in Australia 60 years ago, but I think that's shifted. And I think you're going to find a wave of young men turning up at church. And you see that in sports where young Christian men going into football codes in Australia, for example, in the AFL, there's some famous names, they're staying Christian and they're kind of clear about it, even in their football code.
Stephen, I guess if there's a wave of young men that are about to turn up at your local church, you don't want to miss the opportunity. So the scenario that a bunch of young men turn up and you're wondering why they're there this coming Sunday, what do you think you do as a Christian church, whether you're the leader or whether you're just somebody who sits in the pews and you're recognising that, wait a minute, I don't recognise those faces. What do you do to prepare for those young men?
Well, I think a couple of things. The first thing I would say is just be normal and natural around them. I have a 17-year-old son and he doesn't want everyone fluffing around him. He just wants people to be normal around him. And so I remember meeting a Christian young man who was a tradie who got converted and he thought the men at church were strange because they were overly interested in talking to him. So I think it's just be natural around people. But also you want to preach the gospel to them. You want to say, this is the gospel. It isn't you can try harder and be a better person, because I think that's where Jordan Peterson probably stops. We're saying that Jesus says, no, you are saved by faith. You know, it's God's grace to you in the gospel that saves you. So you don't have, it's not your efforts. And so in one sense, we want to be very clear in how we preach the gospel to people. And then I also think you want to say, now let's spend some time together, not just in groups of young men, but let's show you what older men are like and how they live their lives. Because some of these young men are coming from very broken backgrounds, or just backgrounds where they don't see good family life or good, solid older men life. And I think just modelling that's going to be important to them as well. So and then I think giving them something to do. They want to say, well, how can I help here? I think you always have to say, we're here to serve, not just consume.
I think you used the word crunchy, needing to have something crunchy about church. The aspiration that a young man might have once he gets to those, certainly into the 20s, starting to get life on track, learning to lead, learning that he has value, learning that there are some elements of manhood that you have to learn from others. These sorts of things, they need to be quite obvious in church. I mean, churches and their men's groups, not every church has a men's group. Is this one of those pathways that you need to make sure you're providing when those young men come and they're looking for those models?
Well, yeah, what I think too is that as Christians, if you've been a Christian a long time, grown up in the Christian culture, just assuming you turn up to church, there's these pathways to do things. Young men don't. They have no clue what they're expecting. And I think that's where you say, let's get together as some blokes and let's talk and let's think, but also let's do something. I think men are very good at learning shoulder to shoulder rather than just face to face. And I think that's a key. Do you have men in your church who can disciple people shoulder to shoulder while they're doing a task together, while they're serving someone together? And part of the flip side of that, of course, is that we're raising a generation of men who are addicted to things online, whether it's gambling or porn or just spending too much time gaming. It's very consumer-oriented and saying it's not actually about you at the center of this. This is about serving. And of course, we have the great man, it's Pilate said, behold the man, about the Lord Jesus. And Jesus' ultimate expression of leading as a man was by serving and giving his life up to save others. And I think that's critical to getting ingrained in those young men, but they'll see it modelled by older Christian men.
And those conversations that happen when we work side by side, the practical things of church life, as you say, those are the opportunities, because those conversations will start probably as shallow conversations and they'll deepen from there, because we all have these aspirations to be able to learn what it is to be a man. And so learning those things in church life, the opportunity appears to be showing itself more readily and to be ready for those things. The issues around, and you mentioned, sometimes we think that young men are just caught up in gaming or porn or whatever it might be. There needs to be an alternative on display, doesn't there? And so the men who are in church life need to be on display too, to those young men.
Yes, that's right, and I think that's critical. The whole age thing is important, but also the family thing and how you relate to women. I mean, this is a generation of men and women, young men and young women, who are, it's social media that mediates their relationships with each other. It's online dating. It's how do you relate to a member of the opposite sex. But the church models something different, to the point that, if a group of young men go away for a weekend away together and camping and fishing, it's the Christian group of men where the conversation at the end of the weekend is on a higher plane than the non-Christian group. The conversation doesn't have to descend. And I think older men will have to model that and show that to young men as well. How you treat women is going to be absolutely critical in this whole situation. And I think that's going to be a disciple thing as well, because we just can't assume that they will understand how to do that.
Stephen, have you written any articles about this yet, or is there about to be one appearing on your stephenmcalpine.com website? Where can listeners go to get a little bit more, instruction or inspiration from some of the things we're talking about today?
Yeah, look, I did write one. I wrote one about the Giles Corin going to church, and I also wrote one, a bit of a narrative of what would be going on inside the head of a young man as he rocks up to church one Sunday morning, having never gone. And it's going to be a couple of part series, because I've got him to the front door and onto a seat, and now we have to decide what he's going to think about when he hears what's done in church. So you could go to my stephenmcalpine.com and there'd be those two stories there.
Wonderful insight as always, Stephen McAlpine, award-winning Christian author, pastor, national consultant for churches and Christian schools. That website is stephenmcalpine.com, stephenmcalpine.com. Stephen, thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
Great to be with you, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.